is Christina. I am Whilst Iris Snaps on Instagram and Whilst Iris Snaps Designs, and this is a video about cross stitch. As I'm sure you're already aware from the title, this isn't going to be a regular Flosstube video from me. I have been promising a spool tutorial for ages now, and I finally got around to filming one. As I'm sure you're all aware, there are many different ways to mount a sampler onto a spool, but I found a way that really works for me, and I hope by sharing it, it's going to help some of you too. So my spool obsession, and it is an obsession, started about 2.5 years ago when I released my first spool sampler, the very lovely Bethia Fenshaw 1861. And I've since gone on to release a further 7, including my 3 freebie spool samplers, and I'll show them in a little bit. So Bethia was closely followed by a red sampler, Miss Catherine Annie Jupp. And as you can see, when I turn her around to the back there, she only just fit onto this spool. I made it work. You will fit on there, Catherine. And then came another red sampler, Winifred Webb. As you can see, it's quite a different style spool. We refer to her as Winnie Webb. And then came Florence Rose Mariner. Oh, I do love this one. On mine, P's and Q's Florence, because she neglected to add the P and Q to her alphabet and shoved them in right at the end. A girl after my own heart. And then very recently, I've released C. Moulton, another red sampler. I'll give you a spin. I love the font style of the alphabets, so pretty. And then, as previously mentioned, my freebie spools. Be kind, be brave, and be you. And I finished these ever so slightly differently. Rather than lacing, I tied the ribbon. And as you can probably tell from the spools that I've shown so far, they come in all different shapes and sizes, and I have an ever-growing collection. I will pop in a photograph here. This is just a very small fraction of the spools that I own. As you can imagine, I'm often asked where I source my spools, and I wish there was a single shop that I could just send you the link to, but because I mostly use vintage or antique spools and bobbins, the answer is I buy them in lots of different places. I found them in antique shops, at flea markets, eBay. I have a saved search on eBay for vintage antique spools and bobbins, so I receive alerts if any do come up for sale. I've had some lovely spools from Etsy, and in fact if you're in the States, there is an Etsy shop called Stag Lane Primitives. I'll pop the link in the drop down box below. I have no affiliation with the shop, and I'm not really sure what the customer service is like, although they do seem to have very positive reviews, but they often have this style spool in stock, so they may be one to check out. And again, if you're in the States, I'm sure you already follow Teresa, who has a website called Jersey Girl Stitch Co, selling lovely counting pins. But Teresa also has some spools like this on her website that say property of Gettysburg along the top there. And I think these would be really lovely for my free spool samplers. I'm also asked about cost. Now, once upon a time, as in 2 years ago, I wouldn't really pay any more than £5 for this style spool. But as with everything else in the world at the moment, I have noticed that costs are creeping up. So I purchased this one very recently from Etsy, and I had to fork out £10, which is around $12. So I hope that information helped and that you were able to find some spools or bobbins of your own. Okay, so now to the tutorial. I have here a rather delightful red, surprise surprise, sampler stitched by Margaret Irvine circa 1890, and I know that she's called Margaret because written on the back in very lovely handwriting, I hope you can see that, it says Margaret Irvine, born 12th of February 1878. And I've already charted and stitched Margaret's tiny sampler, and it's this that I'll be using for the tutorial today. You're in for a real treat. There is a cameo from my husband Tom, although it's just his hands and he doesn't actually speak. Maybe next time. So without further ado, here is how I mount a sampler onto a spool. I really hope that it's of some help. As I've already mentioned, this is a sampler that I've stitched especially for this tutorial. This is Margaret Irvine's sampler, and I stitched it on 36 count Steinbeck from Needle Flax Linen using Weeks Dye Works Cayenne, which is this lovely rich red colour. And as you can probably tell, given that my hand is in shot, it is a very small sampler. It's just 57 stitches across and 73 stitches high, so finding a spool to mount it onto shouldn't be too much of an issue. The first thing I need to do is measure the sampler. So Margaret's sampler is approximately 3¼ inches wide by 4 inches high, which means I'll need a spool with an aperture, and by aperture I mean this distance here of at least 4½ inches, which gives me ½ inch to play around with, around 1/4 inch at the top and the bottom. And if I go for a circumference of at least that amount, so 4½ inches, and the circumference is this measurement here, that will give me around 1 inch gap between the fabric edges, which will be enough to show off the lacing. I don't think this spool will work for Margaret's sampler. The circumference just isn't quite enough. So I'm going to measure up another one of my spools to see if it is suitable. So let's see how this spool measures up. This is one of my favourites. It's been in my collection for quite some time now, and I love what appears to be a target painted on the top there. And it has such a lovely patina, although as you can see, it isn't in the best of conditions. It's a bit gnarled, looks like it's been chewed by a dog, but I don't mind that, kind of gives it a bit of character, and besides you won't see it once the sampler's wrapped around it. So what are the measurements of this spool? So my sampler is 4 inches and the aperture of this spool is 4½ inches, so that will give me about 1/4 inch at the top and the bottom to play around with. So that's fine. And then the circumference, oh sorry, the tape measure's upside down now for you. The circumference is 5 inches, so that gives me plenty of room, almost 2 inches, for me to stitch my eyelets, and then enough of a gap to really show off the lacing. So I think this spool is going to be perfect. So the next step is that I'm going to backstitch a border around the sampler. This isn't strictly necessary. You do not have to backstitch a border around a sampler in order for it to be mounted onto a spool. But the reason I do this is so that I'm able to finger press the top and the bottom edges to give a really nice crisp finish. But all will become clear on that a little later. So I know I have about 1/4 of an inch to play with above and below the sampler. Let me just bring back the spoon for this. So I think I'm going to start my backstitched border 6 threads from the top and the bottom of the sampler, and this will mean that the sampler fits comfortably into that aperture there. And I'll bring the backstitch line out to around 12 threads from each side of the sampler. And the reason I do this a little bit wider is so that I'm able to stitch the eyelets into this gap here, and it's the eyelets that I use for lacing the sampler. So let me go and backstitch that border. Okay, so now I've backstitched my border, I need to think about the placement of my eyelets for lacing. I used to just wing this with mixed success, as you can imagine, but I do try to be a little more professional about it these days. So I printed out a blank grid from PC Stitch. The inner line here is the design area of Margaret's sampler, and then the outer line is my backstitched border. You can go for as few or as many eyelets as you wish. I think it's just a case of personal preference. And as you can see, with Bethia Fenshaw's sampler, I went with just 8 eyelets. And then with Catherine Annie Jupp's sampler, I went all out and went with 16 eyelets. I do love how this looks. I've gone somewhere down the middle with Margaret's. I've gone with 12 eyelets, and it took me forever to try and work out how I could have them equally spaced. I'm sure there is some complicated mathematical formula in order to work this out, but I just went with trial and error. And the most equal I could fit them in was with a gap of 10 threads or 5 stitches, and then 8 threads or 4 stitches at either end. So I'll go and stitch my eyelets now. As you can see, I've now stitched my eyelets on either side of the sampler, and I used an Algerian eye stitch over 4 threads. And I've also added some fusible interface into the reverse of the sampler. You don't have to do this, I don't always, but it just gives the sampler a little bit of stability when mounting it onto the spool. And I've gone with a grey rather than a white interfacing, because the white tends to show through against the dark varnish of the spool. And you may also notice that I've cut away the excess fabric. You can do this at any stage during the process really. I chose to leave it to the very last minute because I've been using a hoop when stitching my backstitch line and the eyelets. Now what's left to do is I'm going to finger press the top and the bottom backstitch line to give a really nice crisp edge. So as you can see, I have now wrapped the sampler around the spool in preparation for the lacing, and I am going to use, for the lacing, rather than use Weeks Dye Works Cayenne, I'm going to use DMC 815, which is a really good match. And the only reason I do this is because DMC is significantly cheaper. And I've threaded onto 2 needles 3 strands of DMC, and I've cut the length to 1.5 meters, which is around 60 inches. It seems excessive, but this lacing certainly gets through the thread really quickly. And already things are starting to get a little bit tricky given that I've only got one pair of hands. So I'm going to pause the video and shout my husband over to help me with the next step. Okay, I'm going to get Tom to hold the spool steady while I do the lacing. And I will mention at this stage, if these areas here of the fabric that you folded over, if they become problematic, you can just put in a tiny stitch using a similar coloured thread to the fabric just to secure it down, which is what I've done here, and hopefully you can't see that. That should be well hidden. So now I'm going to thread through each pair of eyelets and cross over the thread as I do so. Right, if I got myself into a knot here. Right, here we go. And there we have it, Margaret Irvine's sampler. I'm really pleased with how she's turned out. If you have any questions at all, please do leave them in the comments below.